St. Jude's Hospital, room 402, late autumn, 1979. The radiator in the corner hissed like a dying snake, a rhythmic, metallic wheeze that filled the gaps in the silence. It was a cold Tuesday, the kind of day where the rain doesn't just fall, it clings to the windows like a gray shroud. I walked down the linoleum hallway, and the scent of floor wax and antiseptic stung my nostrils, a sterile perfume that always reminded me of the thin line between life and the hereafter. My boots made a dull, heavy thud against the floor, a solitary heartbeat echoing in the corridor. I checked the slip of paper in my hand. Alistair Vance. The name carried a weight I couldn't quite explain yet. In the world of the living, Alistair Vance was a titan, a judge whose gavels had fallen with the finality of a guillotine for nearly 40 years. But in room 402, he was just another soul waiting for the tide to go out. I pushed the door open. It didn't creak. It swung with a heavy, silent grace. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of a television that had been muted, casting dancing blue shadows across the peeling wallpaper. There he was, the great Alistair Vance. He looked like a bird fallen from its nest, fragile, skeletal, his skin like wet parchment, stretched too tight over a frame of old wood. He didn't turn his head when I entered. He just kept staring at a brown, weathered envelope resting on his lap. His fingers, spotted with the stains of age and time, were tapping a frantic, silent rhythm against the paper. I sat in the plastic chair beside his bed. It groaned under my weight, a sharp, sudden sound that made him blink. He turned his eyes toward me. They weren't the eyes of a judge. They were the eyes of a man who had seen a ghost and realized the ghost was himself. I introduced myself, my voice sounding low and rough in the small room, like stones grinding together. He didn't ask for a prayer. He didn't ask for a final rite. He just reached out and grabbed my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his frailty. His grip was cold, like ice water in February. He leaned in, the plastic of his oxygen tube crinkling against the pillow. He smelled of old tobacco and the metallic tang of medicine. He told me that for 30 years, the world had called him the iron pillar of justice. He told me how he had enjoyed the way people straightened their ties when he walked into a room. He had been the perfect man, a pillar of the community, a deacon at his church, a man who never missed a Sunday or a sentencing. But as he spoke, his voice began to tremble, a fragile vibration that seemed to shake his entire chest. He looked down at the brown envelope. His breath hitched, a jagged, wet sound that rattled in his throat. He told me that justice isn't always a blind lady with a scale. Sometimes, he said, justice is just a man in a black robe who is too afraid to admit he made a mistake because he likes the feeling of being right more than the feeling of being honest. I watched a single tear track its way through the deep valleys of his wrinkles. It didn't look like a tear of sadness. It looked like a leak from a dam that had been holding back a flood for decades. I felt a sudden, sharp chill in my own chest. As a chaplain, I am trained to be the vessel for other people's sins. But Alistair Vance was pouring something into me that felt heavier than usual. It was the weight of a life built on a foundation of polished lies. He began to talk about 1952, the year of the Great Frost, the year he presided over a case that had defined his career, a case that had sent a young man to the gallows while the town cheered. He described the courtroom, the way the mahogany glowed, the way the air felt thick with the smell of sweat and anticipation. And then he described the face of the boy in the dock, a boy with a scar over his left eye who didn't look like a monster. He looked like a mirror. Alistair's hand shook so violently now that the brown envelope slid from his lap and hit the floor with a soft, hollow thud. I reached down to pick it up, my fingers brushing the rough paper. It felt warm, as if the secret inside was generating its own feverish heat. I looked at the judge. He was gasping now, his eyes wide and pleading. He whispered that he had kept that envelope for 27 years. He had moved it from desk to desk, from house to house, a silent witness to his own cowardice. I looked at the man who had been perfect in the eyes of the world, and all I saw was a hollow shell, crumbling under the weight of a truth that had waited too long to be told. It made me wonder about the masks we all wear, the carefully constructed versions of ourselves we present to the neighbors, while the real us rots in the basement. I thought of my own reflections in the mirror, the times I had chosen comfort over the hard road. The judge's breathing slowed, becoming a series of long, agonizing sighs. He told me to open it. He told me that if he died with that envelope sealed, he would never find rest, not even in the dirt. As my thumb caught the edge of the seal, the sound of the paper tearing felt like a thunderclap in that small, sterile room. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, frantic drumming. I realized then that I wasn't just a chaplain anymore. I was a witness to a crime that time had forgotten, but the soul had remembered with agonizing clarity. Can a man truly be called good if his entire legacy is built upon a single silent lie? St. Jude's Hospital, room 402, the dead of night. The light from the hallway spilled across the floor in a long, sharp rectangle, but it didn't reach the bed where the judge lay. Outside, the wind whipped against the brick exterior of the hospital, a low, mourning sound that felt like it was trying to claw its way inside. My hands felt clumsy as I pulled the contents from the envelope. It wasn't just paper. There were 3 items. A small brass pocket watch with a cracked glass face, a single black and white photograph of a woman standing by a rose bush, and a stack of handwritten notes on judicial stationery. The paper was so dry, it felt like it might crumble into dust between my fingers. I could hear the judge's breathing. It had become a shallow, desperate hitching, the sound of a man trying to catch a spirit that was already halfway out the door. I looked at the notes. The date at the top was July 14, 1952. The ink was faded to a ghostly brown, but the handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, aggressive, and precise. It was the script of a man who believed his word was law. Alistair leaned toward me, his face inches from mine. I could see the tiny, broken veins in his eyes, red like a road map of his regrets. He began to talk about the summer of '52. He described the heat, a thick, wet blanket of a southern summer that made the air in the courtroom taste like iron and sweat. He told me how the ceiling fans just stirred the misery around, never cooling anything. He told me about the boy with the scar, the boy I had seen in the archive photos. He said the boy's name with a sort of reverence that chilled me to the bone. The boy had been accused of a crime that had set the town's blood on fire. A crime that required a villain, and the town had chosen him before the first witness was even called. Alistair told me that he knew, within the first 3 days of the trial, that the evidence was a house of cards. He had seen the inconsistencies in the sheriff's story. He had noticed that the witness, a local shopkeeper with a reputation for drink, couldn't keep his timeline straight. But the town wanted blood. The governor was watching. The newspapers were calling Alistair the last bastion of order in a world falling into chaos. He paused, and the silence in the room became heavy, a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. He whispered that his father had been a judge, and his grandfather before him. He had been raised to be the perfect man, the one who never faltered, the one who never showed doubt. He told me that admitting the boy was innocent would have meant admitting the system he loved was broken. It would have meant admitting that he, the great Alistair Vance, was fallible. So, he did something worse than making a mistake. He steered the trial. He suppressed the testimony of a witness who could have placed the boy 10 miles away. He watched as the jury came back with a guilty verdict in less than an hour. I felt a sudden, cold nausea in the pit of my stomach. I looked down at the brass pocket watch. It had stopped at 4:13. Alistair's voice dropped to a sandpaper rasp. He told me that was the time the boy was pronounced dead. he had kept the watch. The boy's mother had tried to give it to her son before the execution, but they wouldn't let him have it. So she handed it to the judge as he left the courthouse, her eyes quiet and empty. She told him to keep it, so he would always know exactly what time he had killed her son. Alistair reached out and touched the cracked glass of the watch. His hand was trembling so hard it made a tiny, rhythmic ticking sound against the brass. He looked at me, and for a moment, the mask of the judge completely dissolved. He wasn't a pillar of society. He wasn't a man of law. He was a small, terrified child who had committed a murder in the name of propriety. He told me that every night for 27 years he had closed his eyes and seen that courtroom. He heard the fans spinning. He smelled the roses from the photograph. And he felt the weight of that watch in his pocket, a leaden heart that never beat, but never stopped weighing him down. The radiator gave a sudden, sharp bang, like a gunshot in the dark. I jumped, my heart racing. Alistair didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at the photograph of the woman by the rose bush. He said she died a year after her son. He said he had paid for her funeral anonymously, as if a few pieces of silver could buy back the soul he had traded for a career. He looked at me with a desperate, hungry intensity. He asked me if I believed a man could be forgiven for a sin he had never confessed to anyone but a dying woman and a silent room. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. I was thinking about the thousands of people who had looked up to this man. I thought about the awards on his wall and the way the city had named a park after him. It was a beautiful, polished monument built on top of a shallow grave. I realized that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones in the dark alleys. They are the ones in the high seats who are so afraid of losing their perfection that they will sacrifice anyone to keep it. The judge's eyes began to glaze over, the light in them dimming like a candle reaching the end of its wick. He gripped my cardigan, pulling me closer until I could hear the wet rattle of his lungs. He said there was one more thing in the envelope, something he had never told anyone, not even the mother. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my neck, despite the chill in the room. I looked at the judge, this hollowed-out monument of a man, and I realized that the truth isn't just a burden. It's a slow-acting poison. If you don't let it out, it eats you from the inside until there's nothing left but a shell and a secret. I reached back into the envelope, my fingers trembling as much as his. If a life is built on a lie that benefits the world but destroys a soul, was that life ever truly lived at all? St. Jude's Hospital, room 402. 4 in the morning. The hospital was at its quietest. That strange, hollow hour when the world of the living seems to hold its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic click-clack of a nurse's heels far down the hallway. a lonely, mechanical sound that made the silence in the room feel even heavier. I reached into the very bottom of that brown envelope. My fingers brushed against something small and hard, a metal skeleton key, and a final piece of paper folded into a tiny, tight square. It felt heavier than the rest. As I unfolded it, the paper groaned, the fibers snapping after nearly 30 years of being compressed. I held it up to the dim blue light of the muted television. It wasn't a court document. It wasn't a legal brief. It was a confession. But it wasn't from the boy with the scar. The handwriting was shaky, written in a frantic scrawl on the stationery of a local country club. The letter was signed by a man named Julian Vane, Alistair's own younger brother. The date on the letter was August 1952, just 2 weeks after the boy had been executed. I felt a coldness spread through my limbs that had nothing to do with the autumn night. The letter described the crime in horrific, intimate detail, details that only the killer could have known. Julian had admitted everything to his big brother, the judge, begging for mercy, begging for a way out. And Alistair, the iron pillar of justice, had taken that letter, folded it into a square, and buried it in an envelope, while he allowed a mother to bury her innocent son. I looked at Alistair. His eyes were fixed on me, searching my face for a reaction. He wasn't looking for forgiveness anymore. He was looking for a witness to his damnation. He reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my cardigan, his fingernails digging into the wool. He whispered that Julian was the golden boy of the family. He told me that their father had told him on his deathbed to keep the Vane name clean, no matter the cost. And Alistair had paid that cost with someone else's life. He told me that every time he looked in the mirror for the last 27 years, he didn't see a judge. He saw a grave digger. The air in the room felt thick, like I was breathing in wood smoke and old regrets. My heart was thumping a slow, painful rhythm against my ribs. I thought about the boy with the scar, the way he must have looked at Alistair from the dock, hoping for the truth to save him. He had been a sacrifice on the altar of a family's reputation. Alistair's grip on my arm suddenly tightened, then went slack. His jaw dropped open, and a long, rattling sound escaped his throat. A sound like dry leaves being crushed under a boot. It was the sound of a soul finally letting go of a body it had grown to hate. He was gone. The monitor began a high, steady beep that cut through the silence like a razor. I didn't call for the nurse immediately. I stood there, looking at the man who had died perfect in the eyes of the world. I looked at the letter in my hand, the truth that could have changed history. I realized then that if I took this to the authorities, the Vane legacy would crumble. The park would be renamed. The statues would be pulled down. But the boy in the grave would still be dead, and the mother who died of a broken heart wouldn't come back. I felt a strange, bitter heat behind my eyes. I looked at the small skeleton key. It probably opened a drawer in his old office, a place where he kept the rest of his ghosts. I realized that Alistair Vance hadn't given me this envelope so I could seek justice. He had given it to me so he didn't have to carry the weight of it into the dark alone. He had made me a partner in his crime. I walked over to the small sink in the corner of the room. My movements felt slow, as if I were moving through water. I pulled a matchbook from my pocket, the one I used for the altar candles. I struck a match. The flame was small and orange, dancing in the drafty room. I held the corner of Julian Vane's confession to the fire. I watched as the yellowed paper turned black and curled, the words of the real killer vanishing into smoke and ash. I dropped the burning remnants into the sink and watched them swirl down the drain. I am a man of God, but that night I felt like a man of shadows. I chose to keep the lie alive, not for Alistair, and not for the Vane family name. I did it because I realized that some truths are too heavy for the living to bear, and some justice is only ever found on the other side of the veil. I left room 402 as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray sky into a bruised purple. I walked out into the cold air, and for the first time in my life, the weight of my clerical collar felt like a noose. I still see the boy's face when I close my eyes. I see the crescent scar and the quiet, empty eyes of his mother. I wonder if they are waiting for me too. I wonder if, when my time comes, I'll be asked why I chose to protect the memory of a monster instead of the dignity of a victim. If you had the power to destroy a perfect man's legacy to avenge a ghost, would you pull the trigger? Or would you let the dead stay buried?